there's a whole bunch of resources for contemporary producers that emulate or simulate the tools of the trade that we had in the analog era. But the way of putting them together is very different. And the budgets you need are very different too.
Today is Sunday, October 4th, 2020. Who are we speaking with?
Fikentscher, author of You Better Work, Underground Dance Music in New York City, which is 20 years old today.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
What is ethnomusicology?
A discipline that evolved late in the history of musicological studies. The prefix ethno was coined by a Dutch musicologist who felt it necessary to enlarge the study of music worldwide by concepts that didn't necessarily come from Europe or pertain to European music. Holland, as you know, colonized parts of Southeast Asia for a while, and that's the area he worked in. So he dealt with Indonesian music. His name was Jaap Kunst. And this was in the 1940s, I believe. So he coined the word ethnomusicology, which later was shrunk to one word as opposed to being hyphenated. Before that, in the early part of the 20th century, the field of comparative musicology had been launched out of Berlin. And so nowadays, the term comparative musicology has somewhat dropped from usage and has been replaced by ethnomusicology.
Thank you. Let's start. What is house music?
You asked me that during the first week or two, or the first time we met even, at the radio station at NYU. He said, we need to talk. And I wanted to hear all about it. And the first question you asked then was, what is house music? And I said to myself, this man knows what house music is. He doesn't need to ask me that question. So here we are 20 years later, and you still ask me what is house music. There is a short answer, and there's, I guess, many, many other longer answers. I guess the short answer would be dance music originating in Chicago in the 1980s, based on the widespread use of electronic and cheap electronic instruments.
Thank you. What is You Better Work? Both the term and your book.
Okay, the term, well, first of all, it's the title of a RuPaul record, but that's not where I got it from. You Better Work is a form of compliment that I encountered in the scene of underground dance music in New York City in the 1990s, I guess. It's an encouragement to keep doing what you're doing at the moment. That may be a dancer executing very fancy moves. It may be a DJ executing a very convincing mix from one record to another. It may be anything that's worth a positive reinforcing comment. And it's also a playful subversion of the word working, right? Because it's usually used in an environment where people are not at a job. They're not making money, except when you're a DJ getting paid for what you're doing. But it's not work in the Protestant work ethic sense. Rather, it's work because you love what you're doing. So it's a somewhat, it's a subversive term in that sense. I chose that phrase for my book because I was looking for a way to encompass the worlds of music and the world of dance. And since that phrase is used in both contexts, and it comes from the environment that I was studying at the time and wasn't coined by me or some outside authority or influence, I felt it was a justifiable motto or a mantra or quote from the world of underground dance music in New York City at the time.
And tell us about your book, You Better Work.
The book is the result of, or is the reworking of a PhD dissertation in ethnomusicology at Columbia University in the 1990s. This research project was something I very slowly and hesitantly, I guess, at first came to when being confronted with the idea of putting forth a research proposal of original work, contributing to the expansion and enrichment of the field of ethnomusicology. So whereas friends of mine from the classes I took there would go to Brazil or West Africa or Southeast Asia to study a particular musical form or instrument or context there, I decided to work, to remain in New York City and work with the musical environments there. I was particularly struck with the rise of DJ culture in that city, not only in the 1990s, but also in the 1980s and 70s, leading to the emergence of musical forms such as disco and hip hop. In each of these forms, the DJ is a crucial figure. And literature on DJ culture of any sort, when I began thinking about this project, was rather small. So I was able to convince the academic superiors of my program to accept my proposal to research underground dance music in New York City and not having to travel abroad to be able to come back with original work.
Thank you. Two-part question. What is the Paradise Garage? And then describe the experiences of going to the garage, your memories of the garage.
Okay, I'll start with the second question first because it joins with what I've just said. In short, had I not gone to the Paradise Garage in the late 1980s, mid 80s and late 80s, before it closed, I don't think I would have ever chosen this research project in ethnomusicology that I did later in the 1990s. I wound up at the garage by chance because I befriended a member, and little not knowing he was a member at this club. But we were both into music. He was working at a record store, and I was a newbie to New York and interested in the radio landscape and then the live music scene of New York. And in our conversations, he said, you know, instead of asking me all these questions, why don't I take you to a club? And I'd never been to one. So it was a new experience. I was open-minded. I did not know what to expect. And little did I know what it meant to be on that ramp leading up to the first floor where the dance floor was. I didn't know about membership. I didn't know who Larry Levan was. All I know and remember now is that after what seemed like 7 or 8 hours of being at that place, I was dead tired and amazed at my stamina of being able to survive the night on my feet, so to speak, and looking forward to a big breakfast. So I went back to the garage again, only about 2 or 3 more times before it closed, not knowing that it would lead ultimately to the book that I ended up writing. So in hindsight, of course, the garage is maybe the premier institution for underground dance music in New York City. There were many clubs before the garage and there were many clubs after the garage, but to, I think, a lot of people who you might have already interviewed and who you will interview later, and if you look at various sources that have come forth since then, both the resident DJ, Larry Levan, and the location itself, meaning the location of the sound system that Richard Long put together in that venue, set standards to be emulated later and to be raved about and remembered fondly during the time after the garage closed.
You use the term underground dance music. What is that?
That's a chapter in the book, which you have read. So again, another tricky question. So I will not read the entire chapter. I'll be as short as I can. Dance music, without any definition, would be any music to dance to. Underground would be any environment that is kept apart, probably by intention, sometimes by accident, but usually by policy or by intent, away from the mainstream. So it's a protected environment where secret or controversial knowledge about something or other is shared. So underground comics, underground political movements, there are other ways of defining underground environments. Underground dance music, in that sense, could be described or explained with the word post-disco dance music. Disco is the mainstream music of the mid and late 1970s, and due to various reasons, in the 1980s, it almost vanished from the American music scene altogether. Disco was such a bad word, it was replaced. And it was replaced not only in the street by people who talked about it, but also in the media. Billboard magazine, for one example. And so the replacement term for disco, which had become a name for anything and everything, from perfume to jeans to hamburgers, was dance music. So underground then also means it's not in the charts, it's not on Billboard, it's not on radio, it's at a place that you can only hope to find if you have insider knowledge, such as my friend when he took me to be a guest with him to visit the Paradise Garage.
Thank you for that. Talk to us about social dancing and community among people of color and gays in sort of the underground dance music scene.
It's a book, not easily done. In my book, I trace the idea of social dance in an environment that's protected from outside sources or controlling forces, such as a city mayor like Rudy Giuliani, for example. I trace that to the earliest instances of dancing in the New World on the part of enslaved Africans, who with them brought a culture or a cultural understanding that didn't differentiate between music and dance. Music and dance are parts of the same thing. It's also part of a cultural identity then. If you have that kind of conception of music and dance as belonging together or forming one unit, you set yourself apart from European masters who consider the two to be different from each other. Example, at some point, the Catholic Church in Europe banned dancing, kept music. So then there's this long evolution of communal dancing and a reinforcement through a shared concept of music and dance as one unit since, for centuries in the New World, bringing us to the heyday of the Charleston or dancing at religious services on a Sunday morning in church, or the twist, or pretty much any dance form that got a lot of attention coming out of America in the 20th century. The twist being one of them, a famous one. But we can add the hustle. We can add Bobby Sox parties at high school gyms, right? Dancing to rock and roll. There are many, and disco, of course, as well. Plus hip hop, which started as party music. And all the early footage of parties in the Bronx and in Harlem featuring rapping MCs and DJs helping them or working alongside with them always involved dancing. later called breakdancing or b-boying. So this form of dancing has a very, very long and complex and very rich history, too long and too detailed or to be summarized in a few sentences. And there's lots of publications on it as well. My book is just one chapter of that.
Gotcha. What is the importance of the DJ?
In what context?
In the context of underground dance music and clubbing.
Okay. I'll say what I say in the context of New York because it's a special context. And I'll take my starting point, not in radio, where the DJ had played an important role for a long time, but I'll take it at the moment of the Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village in the late 60s. Following that famous legendary riot, there were meetings among not just the patrons of the Stonewall Inn, but among groups of gays in New York in general, to discuss the potential or the aftermath of this momentous event. And these meetings, many of these meetings took place at discotheques or places that people gathered to dance. One such disco was a firehouse, a converted firehouse. Another place was a place called Dom on St. Mark's Place. So one could say that underground dancing in the contemporary sense, or in the sense of the later decades, started in the wake of the Stonewall riots and the meetings and dances that took place. So in a sense, being sloppy, I would say that form of dancing and that form of DJing went parallel to the formation of a collective gay identity and the formation of organizations such as the Gay Liberation Front and others. So the statistic of DJs in the 70s and 80s and 90s up to the present day identifying as gay is not a surprise in that, with that history in mind. And we can now rattle off names and say, see, him and him and him. And it doesn't just apply to DJs, it applies to impresarios and club owners as well. And we're talking here of the clubs that were the important ones in New York. So I may have sidestepped the gist of your question, so remind me if I did, but you wanted to talk about the role of the DJ?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So within this idea of formulating a collective identity in a safe place, and not just talking about it, but also celebrating this collective identity as it was formed, music and dancing were the main vehicles. And the people providing this music in the beginning were not professional DJs. They were people who had a bunch of records or were able to loan some equipment and set it up and run it. This was at the Firehouse, for example. But by the time disco hit big, the DJ became a cultural hero. People may have not gone to Studio 54 for the DJ, but without DJs worked there successfully, studio and the scene there would have not become what it did become. And the underground scene, DJs developed followings, or able to develop loyal followings, largely because they had residencies. You could count on a certain style of presenting music on a certain sound system at a particular location on a weekly basis. And that meant a lot to many dancers. So by the 1990s, you have a person like Junior Vasquez with a loyal following at the Sound Factory, and we can name a few more in other places, and the same dynamic applies. People would follow a certain DJ to hear him or her spin at a particular venue, and people would buy those records, either by artists that the DJ had played on his sound system, or by remixes or productions by those DJs themselves. So we can point to certain labels and certain eras where certain dancers who look at Junior Vasquez, for example, not primarily as a DJ, but as a person who put out records. Same goes for Danny Tenaglia, Frankie Knuckles, David Morales, Louis Vega, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you for that. Why is the 12-inch vinyl critical?
Well, you could say it's not critical at all anymore, except then you would deny the resurgence of vinyl, generally speaking, in the music industry worldwide. But 12-inch vinyl for DJs prior to the digital revolution, ushering in the CD and the MP3 as music formats, was critical because it provided a longer length of individual pieces of music, the extended version, which now fit on an entire side of a record that looked like an LP. Very often at a higher speed, 45 RPM as opposed to 33, and at greater spacing from the needle going around to the next groove, right, between grooves, allowing for better dynamics. So the same song on an album will sound compressed on an LP, but a 10-minute remix on a 12-inch single will sound so much larger and multidimensional. And if you add the improved audio quality at many of the club sound systems of the era, you have a win-win of both. David DePino, one New York DJ, once told me, at a club like Trax, a record that I may have heard on the radio or on my stereo system at home before will come to life. So many of these records that we now remember and cherish were made for those sound systems. They were meant to sound that way. And they could only do it in vinyl, because at the time, CDs were not available for DJs yet. That technology was just around the corner.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about the dancers. What is a dancer's role in relation to the DJ, and what part of dance is performance versus celebration versus release?
It almost sounds like you could separate those aspects in dancing from each other. And I'm not sure they should or they can be separated that way. I think among many dancers, if you were to generalize in this context, in this setting, dancing along to the music provided by a DJ in an environment such as the garage means to, and this has been said so many times, means to transcend the world that you've been in from Monday to Friday. So it's an escape, it's a release, and I'm quoting here from the many, many interviews and statements that I've come across. It's a celebration of self in an environment without any kind of censorship or social regulations and rules. And the overall effect of that is re-energizing and liberating. You can view that against the history of music and dance in the African-American community over centuries in the country, in the US. You can look at it in the context of gay liberation. You can look at it in the context of what does gender mean from Monday through Friday as opposed to Saturday night. The idea of dancing in drag or dancing in costume, which took place at places like the Garage and the Roxy. You can talk about it in terms of experiencing the world around you through dance in a different way you would do within the rules of the outside world, outside of the club. In that sense, the dance floor can be a utopia, an imagined world where the problems of the world outside disappear or don't matter. Problems such as income, gender inequality, prejudice, racism, economic hardship, you name it. Family, all those issues mean a lot for one person or the other, but on the floor, on the dance floor, on the weekend, at a club such as the Garage, these issues cease to matter.
What makes an underground dance music event successful?
Well, you ask 10 promoters or 10 club owners or 10 DJs, and you'll get 30 different answers, I think. Attendance would be one factor, I guess. If a DJ plays to an empty floor, that would be considered very successful. A DJ feeling free to play whatever she or he wants during the course of an evening would be a matter of success, which is not always a given because some club owners or managers feel entitled to tell the DJ what to play, depending on the rules of the engagement. And there are stories of DJs quitting and leaving the DJ booth because they were asked to play a certain record and refused to do so. So that is not very successful. That happens either. I think the values or the transformation of the contemporary or the average world, the everyday world, through the club experience, if that is done successfully, you can go out back into the next week, recharged, re-energized, revitalized, and happy with your own self. And to the degree that you can, the experience at the club was successful.
Talk to us about the distinction between an underground dance music venue versus a party. And I'll give you an example. Well, or you already know where I'm going with this, so.
I'm not sure that I do.
So for example, Club Vinyl is the venue, but then you had very different parties there, right? You had Annie Tenaglia party there, very different crowd and sound. Shelter, very different crowd and sound. Body and Soul, very different crowd and sound. Right.
Well, you're basically talking about the distinction between venue, I mean the location of that has, a door, or it holds so and so many people, it has so and so many exits, and it has this or the other kind of sound system installed already. Or you're talking about the character of a certain party based on a certain concept that has a name like Body and Soul, or that is associated with the reputation and image and style of a certain DJ. So Frankie Knuckles may be playing at venue X, Y, or Z, but if you go to a Frankie Knuckles party, you can expect to hear a certain type of music program. Maybe even a certain type of crowd, because Frankie draws a certain type of crowd, or replace his name with anybody else. Venue may be dictated by what is available. There's this famous chapter in New York dance music history where there was a shooting at one club which had to close, and the party at that venue had to move to another club for a certain amount of time. So people had to spread the word around, because this was not part of media discourse, that don't go there tonight. Usually we go there, but it's closed, so we have to go to the other location. There was even a shuttle service between the two addresses, as you may recall. So for some time, people went to venue B as opposed to venue A to have the same kind of party. And I did so too. And one week went back to venue B, and the person at the door said, "You can't come in." And I said, "Why?" He said, "You got the wrong shoes." I said, "Excuse me? I've been wearing similar shoes for the last couple of weeks going to the same party." He said, "That's not the party that's here tonight. We have another party. It's a dress-up party." Meaning that night, the party I had been meaning to attend had returned to the old location, to the old venue, venue A. I found out through my shoes.
I want to talk about underground dance music venues and parties. I'd like for you to describe the topic that I bring up. So What is Deep Sea?
Deep Sea, I don't think exists anymore.
Does not.
Deep Sea was a party that moved from one location around the corner to the other location, both on the Lower East Side, both, I think, less than 60 seconds from each other, in the early 2000s. And it was a weekly event, and it was a strictly underground dance music event. Both venues were small. Both venues catered to a drinking audience, meaning both venues had a liquor license. And the space to dance in both locations was limited, let's say. So were the sound systems compared to something like the Paradise Garage. But this typifies the scene of underground dance music in the new millennium, I would say, generally speaking, roughly speaking, because by that time, many of the larger clubs had been closed and many DJs could only work in small bar type places. So Deep Sea was one of those events.
Who were the resident DJs and what was the sound?
The main resident DJs were E-Man, Eric Clark, and Lola Rifan. And then I was a guest DJ for one-offs, maybe once a month or once every 2 months for the year 2000 and 2001. The sound was experimental, I would say. It was not commercial. But I remember being told once while I was playing from my record selection during the early part of the night to watch the bar.
Meaning?
I was guessing. I was like, what do they mean? How can my musical selection promote or hinder the consumption of alcohol? Because dancing couldn't be the main focus. So I guess it had to do with playing music that suited the musical taste, the musical palette of the patrons. So experimental, yes, but not too experimental.
What was Bang the Party?
Bang the Party was another satellite party, or a party that moved from one location to the other. Here the locations were in Manhattan and then later Brooklyn. And the party was run and set up and titled by Eric E-Man Clark and Lori Cabal. And this party also ceased to exist at a certain time, but it ran successfully. I would say I went to many of those in the mid-2000s.
Talk to us about production. What is unique about underground dance music production that promotes or encourages dance, if there's a way to describe it?
It's very tough to generalize because so much has changed in the production mode of this type of music. First of all, underground dance music does not categorize one style of music. So the sounds might be very different. The tempo might be similar, but the instrumentation might differ, etc. The production used to be based on productions during the disco era, albeit on a much more scaled down and more lower budget context, or limitations of a lower budget, facilitated by the use of electronic instruments, as I mentioned earlier. But now that we're dealing with instruments in the digital era, laptops, samples, there's a whole bunch of resources for contemporary producers that emulate or simulate the tools of the trade that we had in the analog era. But the way of putting them together is very different. And the budgets you need are very different too. So I'd rather you rephrase the question and make it much more pointed or easier to answer.
I have a different question. I want to go back to venues and clubs. Okay. What was Club Zanzibar?
Okay. Yeah, another famous venue located in Newark, New Jersey, and at the time very often seen as the alternative or rival even of the Paradise Garage. Very loyal following, as did the Paradise Garage. A resident DJ as famous or as influential as Larry Levan at the PG by the name of Tony Humphries, but he was not the only one. Then again, Larry also had colleagues playing at the Garage. He wasn't the only one. So we can consider Larry Levan and Tony Humphries peers. I was told that by people who had been to both locations in the early 1980s, mid 1980s, that the atmosphere at those two places was very different. I've danced at the Garage, but I performed at Zanzibar, so I can't really compare very well. I don't know what the dance floor at Zanzibar felt like, because I was so busy focusing on the stage act I was involved with on the stage of Zanzibar at the time. But both places today are considered legendary in the sense that they had their own style made famous by the resident DJs. And if we consider Zanzibar the leading venue to promote the Jersey sound, we can look at the Garage and the fact that a dance music subgenre named Garage or Garage, UK pronunciation, came out of that second venue. So these were not just venues for DJs and famous parties or very good sound systems. They also, we could say, are responsible for an era of dance music style or sound that came out of those venues and led to these subgenre names.
Let's talk about people.
Dangerous. Everybody knows everybody's business.
Yes. Tony Humphries, what is his importance in underground dance music culture? What is his significance?
I'm not sure that I can rank him or describe him in just one way or the other, but I'll try and contextualize his influence the way I see it from having met him and talked with him, not only in the DJ booth, but also in the recording studio. In his life, Tony's a great example of the DJ that manages to work in very different environments and do so successfully. Tony had a radio show on KISS, correct me if I'm wrong, for some time, a mix show. Tony was the head of a record label putting out dance music for some time. As I said, Tony had the residence at the Zanzibar for many years. And Tony was a chief DJ on the New York circuit, playing various venues consistently. Tony also toured. He was booked into clubs in the UK and Japan, as far as I know, maybe even other places as well. So in a sense, he's an example of very few DJs who managed to cover all the bases available to DJs in the 1990s.
Frankie Knuckles.
Same thing. Or many of the points that I made regarding Tony apply to Frankie as well. The interesting story, of course, is the fact that he's considered the Godfather of House due to his association with the Warehouse in Chicago. He's from the Bronx, but he moved to Chicago and was there at a very important time in the 1980s, early 1980s, when, late 70s, early 80s, when this music we now know as house music emerged there first. Of course, it's also important to note his close friendship with Larry Levan at the Paris Garage. And that Tony, to me, by contrast, always struck me more as a professional loner in that sense. Not to say that negatively, but in comparison to Frankie, Frankie always started his career, in fact, at Nicky Siano's gallery alongside Larry, his running buddy.
What was Sound Factory Bar?
Sound Factory Bar, as the name says, was an extension or a satellite off of Sound Factory, another club, a big club in New York. Sound Factory Bar, as the word bar indicates, did serve alcohol, which Sound Factory didn't, had a liquor license, and was a smaller venue by comparison. Sound Factory Bar in its heyday had residents on at least four nights a week: Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So depending on the DJ that you liked, you could go out one of 4 nights a week or all 4 nights a week. And you would encounter different crowds inside the same venue, dancing to various types of music on the same sound system. Another other interesting feature that Sound Factory didn't have is that Sound Factory Bar had a basement, the so-called funk hut. And there, 2 other DJs besides the main DJ on the main floor upstairs would play. Very often a program of classics or more obscure records and more experimental older records, as opposed to the new yet unreleased stuff that sometimes would be playing upstairs.
Who are some of the DJs in the funk hut?
Camacho, Kim Lightfoot, Andre Collins. I remember the funk hut from Wednesday nights, which is when I usually went to Sound Factory Bar. I didn't go on Thursday, Fridays, or Saturdays as much, and don't remember the DJs on those other 3 days. The reason is that on those nights, if I went, I usually chose to dance and listen to the DJs upstairs. Frankie Knuckles had a Friday night for some time. Lord G had the residence on Thursdays. I forgot who did Saturdays.
Controversial question. I'm hoping you'll answer. Uh-oh. What is Soulful House?
Oh, okay. Well, first it was house. Then there was acid house. I think I'm doing this correctly in chronological order of these terms surfacing in frequent usage. Then there was deep house. Then there was tribal house, I think the next one was. And somewhere along the line came soulful house. Now, mind you, house, deep house, acid house, tribal house were all categories of house music produced and disseminated and cherished and danced to predominantly by people of color. Soulful uses the term soul, another term that is used in many, many different contexts, but is also used to describe music, soul music. So to say soulful house is almost redundant because house is already soulful. So something happened to make, perhaps, and maybe it only happened in New York, because I'm not sure that, I haven't seen flyers from Houston or LA or San Francisco or Dallas or Milwaukee for a soulful house party. I haven't even seen those flyers in Chicago, but I may be wrong, that these flyers may exist. To me, soulful house is a New York idea. And I think it came about because of another term that came about after tribal, and that was progressive house. And the followers of progressive house and the followers of soulful house don't like each other's tastes. And it had to do with color, not just sound. The progressive house crowd is not predominantly a person of color crowd, I think. It's also a European term, I think. Progressive house, I'm not sure who coined it, but it seems to me to have its, I wouldn't be surprised if it had its roots in England. That's one factor. The other is, I think, what happened to house in the post-Giuliani era in New York, because house music was under siege. With the changeover from analog to digital, with the policies of Giuliani and Bloomberg, closing large venues, with residencies disappearing, record labels going out of business, record stores closing. There was a shrinkage of sort. And so to me, Soulful House is a defense. It's a defensive strategy to focus on a core audience or a core style, however defined. It's not really a descriptive term to me, because to me, house music by definition, as post-disco dance music, is soulful. So I don't use the term much.
Let's dig a little deeper. What effects did Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg have on New York nightlife?
Well, if we remember how controversial disco was to some, but it's not just a revisiting of the issues that led to the disco riots in Comiskey Park, put on by a disgruntled rock radio DJ. When it comes to New York City, much more is involved. A lot of it has to do with real estate and the money that goes with real estate, with limited real estate, such as the one on Manhattan. So how do you tackle this? Pose the question again.
What effect did Mayors Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg have on New York City nightlife?
Well, their administrations were adamantly opposed to the nightlife industry of the city. They were more interested in drawing investment money to the city. And a lot of that money came with people who didn't dance. So that's one thing. The other thing was the idea that from the outside, the scene of night clubbing could be associated with, sometimes correctly so, with drug use and drug traffic. I'll just refer to the limelight under Peace Education's reign, which was a constant barrage of drug scandals. So Giuliani, as a law and order guy, and then to some extent Mayor Bloomberg after him, made it a program, or a stated program to combat this cultural outgrowth or growth, cancerous growth in the culture of the city. And he used an old law to make that happen. The cabaret license law of 1920, what? You can look it up. So the combination of dancing and liquor, of course, goes back to the Prohibition era. It was reinstated by the powers of Giuliani and his administration. And it made life for club owners and impresarios very, very difficult. But I'm not sure that they're the only ones responsible for New York losing its predominant position as the capital of dance music at that time. There may be other factors as well, but they certainly were contributing factors.
What is the Clubhouse Jamboree?
Oh, that's an outdoor event held annually for, help me, 27 years, 28 years. Canceled this year for the very first time ever. Held in Prospect Park and put on by how do I say it? He's not a professional DJ, but he's been in the dance music world in New York for decades. Little Ray, who hires a half a dozen DJs to share the wheels of steel, as they were, at this outdoor event. So it's a big sound system. People have a cookout. People socialize and people dance in the forest. It's a wooded area, and the city of Brooklyn has given him a permit to do this annually.
What is the Jersey sound?
Oh boy. The Jersey sound has to do with the demographics of Newark and Jersey City to an extent. It has to do with the very strong presence of African-American churches in those two urban areas, and the musical influence of that tradition. So gospel house, another one of those categories that I didn't mention yet, I would associate primarily with the influence from places like Newark and Jersey City. And since many of the DJs working there also live there, the name Jersey Sound is not far-fetched. It's also a way to assert local pride, because many of people who live in Newark or Jersey City commute to New York. And so it's easy to think of those places just as an extension of the metro New York City area. But if you say Jersey Sound, you say we have something of our own. And to an extent, I think that is said rightfully.
What is the Love Parade?
We're switching continents. The Love Parade, to my thinking, is the record-holding event of a public gathering with music, with dance music, in Berlin for a number of years. At one point, the record was over 2 million, a peaceful gathering to the sound of electronic dance music. Most of that music would not be called house, might be called techno. I've never attended Love Parade, so I can't say, but I've seen footage of the event of many years.
Who is Cassio Ware?
Cassio Ware is part of a production team from New Jersey called the Black Rascals. I guess a pun on the Latin rascals who were from Queens or Brooklyn, Queens. And a trio of dance music producers, dancers, who produced an EP in 1987 called, help me, Back to the, oh boy. If I had my book with me, which I don't, I could show you the picture of the cover of that record. I was after that record for a long time because one of my favorite tracks to dance to ever is on that record, on that EP, called Definition of a Track. And I met Cassio through that hunt, because I wanted to meet the people who put that track together, because to me it was so successful. It was so minimal and yet so catchy. Later I met the other two as well. But with Cassio, I struck up a friendship because during one of our first conversations, he said, I'm looking for a guitar player to perform with my troupe. I have a house act or a dance music act to perform at places like Zanzibar. And I said, well, I happen to be a guitar player and I'd love to work with you. And so we did. So he's one of my special friends in the underground dance scene.
What was House to Learn?
House to Learn was a series of events of me spinning from my own record collection at Deep Sea, the aforementioned Deep Sea. And together with Lola and with Eric's support, we came up with this idea that it wouldn't be just a bunch of records that I would throw together to open up an evening. of hanging out at that bar, but to find a theme to pull certain records around to. And I would then almost moderate these records using a microphone. I kept the talking to a minimum though, because I wanted to really privilege the music. But here and there, I would talk about the producer of a certain record. I think there was one evening where I played nothing but Larry Heard records, or only records from Chicago from a certain time period. So there was a very small amount of moderation, also not to distract from the dancing if there was anybody dancing. And I didn't want to make it too academic or too teachy-preachy, but it was tolerated and welcomed by some who said, you know, I learned something from your way of moderating a track that I either have never heard before or that I never heard or considered in that context.
What was the candy store?
I think the Candy Store was the name of a program of underground dance music at NYU's radio station. And I think that's where we met. And the person who invited me to come up and promote the book, because I was at the time running through New York promoting this new, recently published book, was T.O. Sweet. And he had a radio show that he moderated and that he played obscure tracks and took phone calls from listeners at NYU radio.
How inclusive is house music?
Inclusive. Of course, I would say inclusive of what? I think from the get-go, the idea was if you feel you belong, you belong. So I would look at an answer to that question by looking at the way the Warehouse started, and the audience of the Warehouse became the loyal following of Frankie Knuckles. And I was never there during the time and only heard stories and saw pictures, but my impression is that the Warehouse became a refuge for a lot of social outcasts of Chicago at the time. So by definition, then it was very inclusive. By design. Anybody could jack, supposedly.
What's next for house music?
Wow. I think you can only talk about that if you knew where house music was at right now. So the question could be, first, where's house music now? And then we can talk about where it might go. But that's speculative. To speculate about musical developments is usually futile, so I'll rephrase your question and rather turn to the question of where is house music in 2020? And then the question is, are we talking, in what context? Are we talking Chicago? Are we talking New York? Are we talking the US mainstream? Frankie Knuckles' Whistle Song was the soundtrack of a Nestea commercial, but that's years ago. Louis Vega became a Grammy Award winning producer. He's a house man. Where is house music in Europe? I would say with the exception of the UK, barely anywhere. Very small, to my thinking, very small circles of house music fans in places like Frankfurt or Berlin or Amsterdam. Who is producing house music? Answer, a lot of people. I recently read that the weekly output of dance tracks in digital form, primarily through the internet, is 20,000 or so. Nobody can absorb that much music, even if it were a third or a quarter of that amount. So house music once was the privilege of very few people who had the idea of working with an 808 or a keyboard that they could barely play, but they came up with tracks like Mysteries of Love or Washing Machine, or a reworking of an old Isaac Hayes song. And now, like the statement goes, everybody's a DJ, which means anybody can produce house music, or call it that. David Guetta says he used to be a house music DJ, and look at what he's doing now. Is that the future of house music? I hope not. So a lot of things, to me, those two questions, if they were one question or two parts of one question, have to do with the idea of what is the underground? What is the knowledge and the context that needs to be preserved and held privy only to a select few? Why is it important that it be kept that way? For whom is house music important? Or is house music just experiencing the same kind of development many other popular musical styles have gone through, which is to say, you might go into a shoe store and hear house music and nobody cares. Which has been the case in some, Todd Terry's Missing You remix of Everything But the Girl, fabulous record, became shoe store music. Good for Todd, but what does that mean for the idea of an underground? If you go into any old shoe store along 8th Street in Manhattan and hear that music. These questions to me are too general and they're too speculative to say anything about, because the answers differ widely depending on who you ask. And if you have 10 different answers to that kind of a broad question, what do you make with those 10 different answers? I'm not very comfortable with such wide speculations. It's the way people talk now on CNN for 12 hours on end on what it means that Donald Trump has COVID-19. It's all speculative. It's not news, but the news is a 30-second reporting that he has COVID-19 or that he hasn't. But then to go on for 12 hours to debate the potential consequences of that is like saying, where's house music going? We don't know. David Guetta doesn't know. He doesn't care, as far as I'm concerned.
Woo! The shade. Okay, I'll ask you a specific question. What's next in house music for Kai? Another book? A residency? A single? An album? Collaboration?
Good question. I haven't DJed in a while. Not because I didn't want to, I did want to, but because the open turntable night in Munich that I discovered closed, ceased to exist. And I did not venture out into finding another night that I could play regularly at. It was a monthly at the time. I would like to DJ the way I had learned on 2 turntables and a mixer using vinyl. I might even enjoy playing music on MP3, CDs, and USB sticks. I would not be adverse to learning that. Is it going to happen soon? I'm not so sure. I'm certainly one of the people who can't keep up with 20,000 releases every week. And so I trust my network and global house music to alert me to good songs or successful songs, catchy tunes. Roizen's Machine CD is a recent discovery, and I think I'm gonna look out for remixes of some of the cuts on that CD, as an example. So to me, I associate house music with the time I lived in New York City, and had come to look at that city not only as a home for very good jazz or underground rock music, but also a very, very good dance music. And so I cherish my collection of music from that time. So in that sense, house music also has a very nostalgic element attached to it. Current house music, I think, is, dare I say it, next to insignificant. It's become part of a musical palette that, you know, people in advertising or film or event programmers may use if they care about the difference. You know, in Germany, house and techno are frequently used in the same breath. And I don't think they are, but that's how it's looked at. So the innovative factor, or the innovative spell that house music had in 87, 88, 89, the way London reacted to the records coming in from Chicago, for example, which was an explosion, that's gone. And I don't see those people who are now at the helm of this music, who have arrived, who have the wherewithal, have labels, have studios, have a catalog attached to them, doing much in the way of promoting a sound, calling for a development or promotion of a sound future of this art form. Maybe we need the next wave. Maybe we need to have a backlash, or not a backlash, a nostalgic turning back to the roots of, you know, the way neo-soul was formulated a number of years back with people like D'Angelo and Anita Baker, sounding or making records that could have been made 10, 15, 20 years earlier. I wouldn't mind some house records that sound like they were made 30 years earlier. But that's just my take.
Is there anything that I did not ask you that you wish to talk about with regard to house music, club culture, underground dance music?
Well, there's something I didn't answer, and that was the idea that I might write a second book on this type of music. People asked me this a number of times and said, will there be You Better Work Part 2? And I don't jump on the idea, or I don't feel too excited about the idea of writing such a book, although it'd be very interesting because the way this music has been put together for the last couple of years is very, very different from the way it was in the 1980s and 90s. So it's not completely impossible to consider a follow-up work. But I think the historians of dance music are already on the ball. They're already working. And there are a number of books that have come out after my book came out that chronicle various dance scenes in New York, such as the Loft and others. So what prompted me to start this whole project was my sense that nothing really had been done on the DJ as a cultural force, and a cultural shaper. That's very different today. We can now look back at a whole bunch of publications, films, interviews, photo books, etc., that cover that ground. And so in a way, it might be a little self-congratulatory to say the job has been done. But I would need probably a little more than just the theoretical perspective of looking at dance music production in the digital age, which might be a working title for a new book. It might come about, but I think I would also have to hear the music with the ears that perked up the way they perked up when I heard the first couple of Marshall Jefferson records on a friend's turntable. And I was blown away. I was like, this is different. This is something I've heard a lot of music, but I haven't heard this. Who makes this music and why? If I listen to another one of those 20,000 records on TrackSource, I don't ask that question anymore. So
yeah.
grab me, DJs. work, maybe, you know.
Thank you very much.
All the best to you.
You as well. Have a good night. Thanks again. Have a good night. Bye-bye.